The moral methods of mixing norms. Now, this method is used in order to move from one normative area to another. We saw it back in the introduction talking about ethics, that you can think of the siblings of ethics as other normative areas, other value areas, such as religion, law, etiquette, and aesthetics. And people often want to go from one normative area, say ethics, to law, and reason that because something is immoral, it should be illegal. Or if something is morally right to do, that it should be, legal or legally compelled. People also want to often go from religion to morality or law, or both. So a person may think that because something is commanded in their religion, that this is automatically good. And if something is forbidden in their religion, it is automatically morally evil. Or in the case of the law, a person might reason that because their religion forbids something, it should be illegal for everyone. Or if their religion, compels something, that it should be required legally of everyone. Now, it is, of course, possible to rationally and logically and philosophically go from one normative area to another. But not surprisingly, people often use a flawed method, a method that does not logically justify the movement from one area to another. Now, to lay it out in formal terms, it's essentially a two-step argument, with one premise and one conclusion. And that's where the problem lies. The move is too quick and unjustified. So, generically speaking, formally speaking, premise one would be that X has status S in normative area Y, and the person just simply concludes that therefore X should have the comparable status to S in normative area Z, so a different normative area. For example, if a person says that a particular thing, say eating shellfish, is a sin in religion, therefore it should be illegal in the law. Or that because, say, cheating on one's partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, etc., would be immoral, therefore it should be illegal. Now, simply going from one area to another with no intervening step would be flawed, would not be justified. Now, at this point, someone may be thinking, but, why can't I just go from my religion to morality, or right from my morality to law? Why can't I do that? And as a practical matter, of course, one can do it, but logically it would be unjustified. The mere fact that something is immoral doesn't entail that it therefore should be illegal, or that something is, say, restricted in a religion, and therefore it should be automatically considered illegal or immoral. Fortunately, for those who wish to mix norms, go from, say, religion to law, or ethics to law, or religion to ethics, there are justified ways of doing this, in the sense of logically justified, philosophically justified, as opposed to, say, like theologically justified or politically justified. So how is this done when one is engaged in a moral argument, as opposed to, say, a theological imposition? Well, the method, step by step, is this. So, put in, in formal terms, the first step is to establish that X, whatever you're talking about, has a particular status S in normative area Y. Step 2 is to have a premise or argument that connects area Y in normative area Z. And then the final step is to essentially make the conclusion that therefore X should have the comparable status to S in normative area Z. So, to use a concrete example, suppose somebody establishes through like biblical evidence that consuming shellfish, like lobsters, etc., is considered an unclean activity. So let's say just sinful, just to be generic about it. And then what one would need to do is connect, if you want to go and argue that it's immoral, you need to connect religion to ethics. And this can be done pretty easily. As I mentioned before in earlier videos, there's a theory called divine command theory, that whatever God says is good because God says so, whatever is bad because God says so. So in the second step, one can make the transition by appealing to divine command theory. Now, of course, to make an effective argument, one would have to give reasons why divine command theory should be accepted. It can't simply be assumed. But divine command theory is a way of making that transition. So that's the general approach to the method. The idea is establish that what you're talking about has a particular status in one area. Then you need to have a premise or argument linking the area you're talking about to the one you want to connect it to, and then draw the appropriate conclusion. Now, the argument would typically look like this, and laying it out formally. Premise 1 would be that you establish that X has status S in normative area Y, and this can often be fairly easy. For example, if you're going from religion, you would look at the appropriate religious text. If you're going from law, you could look at the relevant law, and that first step is often easy with certain assumptions. Now, establishing whether or not it truly is, say, evil or good, or should it be illegal, is another matter. So premise 2, you connect the two normative areas, Y and Z, and you give a reason. We'll call this reason R as to why they're connected, and then you conclude that X should have the comparable status to S in normative area Z because they're alike. And in some ways, you may be thinking back to the argument by analogy. In some ways, they're similar. So essentially what you're trying to show is that these two areas are alike. So if something is, say, sinful in religion, that it should be comparably bad in ethics, like, evil. Or if something is a sin in religion, that it should have a comparable status in law, which of course would be illegal. And the challenge, of course, is making that connection. So the ways to make the connection are typically existing theories, and there are fortunately various theories that have been created specifically to do this. I gave the example of divine command theory, and under divine command theory, this is the view that morality is determined by the religion. Literally the case that what God commands is good because he commands it, and what is bad because God forbids it. And so if you could establish divine command theory, or at least give reasons to accept it, this would justify moving from religion to ethics. As another example, there's a theory called legalism, or legal positivism. It's a view that morality is determined, or should be determined, by the laws of the state. So inferences from the legal norms, the laws of the state, would be justified, assuming that legalism is correct. Now, so one approach when using the theory approach is simply do what's called arguing in context. You could state in the paper or your argument that you're making your case in the context of a particular theory, like you're looking at it in the context of divine command theory, or looking at it in the context of legalism. Now, the weakness of this, of course, is that only someone who already accepts a theory or considers it plausible would simply accept the inference without argument. So, for example, if someone doesn't accept the theory already, they, of course, would find it less plausible. But, it can work, and it is a, acceptable way to argue ethically, to argue in the context of a theory to see the implications of a theory. But of course, simply saying I'm assuming the theory just rests on that assumption. It doesn't actually prove the theory is correct. Now, of course, you can also argue for the theory, but that will often require a great deal of work. So, for example, attempting to support or prove divine command theory in the course of a paper to make the transition from religion to ethics, that would be quite a bit of work. However, you can give some reasons as to why a theory should be accepted within the context of a short paper. Because of this, because of the trying to establish an entire moral theory just to make the transition, generally, if there's an easier or more direct way to argue for the transition, then establishing an entire theory just to argue that a particular thing that is sinful should be immoral or illegal would be kind of a bit of overkill and perhaps, a lot of work for a small accomplishment. Now, another way to do it is to not base it on, pre-established theory, but to argue for the transition. And this is generally a bit easier than trying to support and establish an entire theory. And so what you try to do is provide an argument that makes that connection. And of course, the effectiveness of this method of trying to argue for the connection depends on the quality of the argument for that connection. So how can one, make such an argument? Well, the idea is to try to show your reader, try to show them logically why the inference is justified, why the fact that something is, say, sinful should make it immoral, or the fact that something is immoral should make it illegal. For example, here would be a pretty short argument that would need more development, for a full paper, but here's a way one could argue for just such a transition. So suppose to begin with the general assumption that the state, the government, exists to protect people from harm. So the laws of the state on this approach are designed to protect people from harm by making things that are harmful, at least certain things, illegal. So things that are immoral would generally be harmful. At the very least, they would damage the person's moral character. So if we believe that the state should protect people from harm, then reasoning from, say, that a particular thing is immoral and very harmful, then you can make a reasonable connection that given the state has the obligation to protect people from harm, something that is morally harmful, very much so, should be made illegal by the state to protect the citizens. And so that is a way to do it. Now, how you make the transition would depend a great deal on what you're arguing about, where you're trying to go from and get to, but there are various ways to make that case. And sort of the focus is trying to show the reader logically why you should make the transition from one area to another. Now, we saw back in the beginning of the course, looking at sort of the family of normativity. Law, religion, aesthetics, and morality are all part of the family of norms. They're things that involve values and judgments. Now, in making the transition from one area to another by mixing norms, there are many things to consider. Take, for example, the case of law. If we're trying to reason from the law to morality, there are great variations in laws, and this tends to limit the sort of inferences you can make from law to other areas, and can lead to various problems such as contradictions. For example, prostitution is legal in some parts of the United States, but not in most other parts. So if we're making an inference from law to morality, we would have to infer that prostitution is both moral and immoral. Now, there's a way to work around that. One, of course, can embrace a form of moral relativism comparable to legal relativism and say that where it's illegal, it's immoral, and where it's legal, it's morally acceptable. There are also many different views of the foundation and purposes of laws. So this can lead to problems making inferences from the law to other areas, or from other areas to the law. For example, the United States has, at least in theory, a commitment to a legal separation of church and state. Essentially, the constitutional limitation on the state being able to establish a religion. So, in the context of the United States, inferring from religion to law would be problematic. This is not to say that people don't do it, and one could still make an argument that you should go from religion to law or religion to morality, even when there's an explicit rule against that, or especially when there's an explicit rule against that. Turning to religion. Now, one obvious problem with making an inference to or from religion is that it will generally only be acceptable to those people who believe that religion, and in that particular version. For example, pork is forbidden by some religions, but most other religions don't. And so your typical American would generally not accept the reasoning that because pork is forbidden in some religions, therefore, pork should be outlawed, or that it's immoral. And even within a single religion, even if you have people who all profess the same general faith, there's a great deal of variation. And this makes inferences, from religion problematic, even if everyone happens to agree on it, the general principles. For example, in the United States, many people profess to be Christians, but there are obviously many, many major differences between the various Christian groups, between like Catholics and Methodists and Episcopalians. And even within the Catholic Church, for example, there's a great deal of variation. Also, bringing in an entire religion and all the accompanying metaphysics to solve like a single moral problem could be seen as a bit of philosophical overkill. And the final problem with religion is that if one is trying to settle, say, a moral dispute by bringing in religion, kind of the problem is that the religion used and its assumptions are often as or more controversial than the point being argued for. So trying to settle, say, a dispute in ethics by appealing to religion, the problem there is that it only works, again, on people who already agree with the religion. Next, aesthetics. Aesthetics, of course, is all about art and beauty, and it's often seen, because it's about art, it's often seen as being trumped by law, morality, and religion. That considerations of, law or considerations of morality or religion just override it. We should, yield to those. And this can often make inferences from aesthetics to other areas too difficult, going from like art to morality or art to religion. And it can often make going from going from one area to aesthetics far too easy. So this can occur as an example. It's generally assumed that even if something, say, has some artistic value, that laws should still, be imposed upon it. Like graffiti being a good example. That no matter how beautiful the graffiti is, it's generally still considered to be a crime by some. But this, of course, can be debated. Now, another concern is that areas where aesthetics and these other areas overlap are often seen as belonging to those areas as opposed to being like under aesthetics. So, for example, censorship of art is often seen primarily as legal, if it's a question of the laws, or as morality, a question of ethics rather than aesthetic. And so there is that problem. Also, rather like with religion, making an inference from, aesthetics to other areas would be problematic because there's a great deal of disagreement in aesthetics. I mean, there's not like typically great battles like we see between religions, but there are a wide range of aesthetic theories, and people disagree about, say, for example, beauty. Plato held that beauty is an objective thing. Other thinkers, hold to the view that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And so going from aesthetics to other areas is going from one controversy to another. Another concern is that the concerns of aesthetics are often seen as removed from those of other areas, thus making the inferences more difficult. For example, one might ask, what implications does a theory of beauty have for law, religion, or morality? This is not to say that people haven't attempted to make such arguments, but they can be challenging to do. A final concern is that, even more so than ethics, aesthetics is often unfairly regarded as a area of pure opinion. And this can make, making the inferences more difficult. And last, but certainly not least, morality. Now, going, from morality to other areas can be problematic because, morality itself is highly controversial. And so attempting to go from what is ethical to what the law should be, or there are actually arguments that one should use morality to typically eliminate religion. The ethics itself is very controversial. So attempting to settle a dispute by going to an area that's also disputed can be challenging. Now, there are moral theories based on other normative areas, which one could say could make other inferences too easy perhaps or too difficult. We've seen the two examples of divine command theory, which makes inferences from religion to morality automatic, but automatically precludes inferences from morality to religion. Because if divine command theory is true, one of its sort of, some consider defects, is that whatever God says is good because he says so, and then in a way God becomes, to say that God is good, it effectively is meaningless. And we'll see more of this when we talk about moral theories. Legalism does the same thing for law. So if legalism were true, one of the consequences is you could never morally criticize the law because the law would always be right, which could be acceptable to some. Now, this is a dispute over the foundation and purpose of morality, which, of course, can make such inferences problematic. So, for example, we saw back in the beginning that relativism is the view that morality is based in the culture, so making an inference from morality to international law would be problematic, and so those considerations come into play as well. So mixing norms is something that can be done, but it has to be done, properly from the standpoint, again, looking at it from the standpoint of philosophical argumentation. And it is, of course, fraught with difficulty, but in theory, doable. So how does one respond to a mixing of norms? This could be a case where, say you're mixing norms in your paper and you want to raise an objection against your own view of the mixing of norms, or you're arguing against someone else's use of it. Well, here's how to respond, as to say, object to or attack a mixing of norms. So the first approach is to attack that first premise, that the normative status of X, as presented in the first premise of the method, can be challenged. So doing this would involve arguing, of course, that the thing in question does not have the alleged status. So if one is arguing that something, if a person makes an argument that something is sinful, so it should be illegal, there's a way to counter that by arguing that it is not sinful. To use an example, in Leviticus, there is a claim that, essentially that seafood, shellfish, is unclean, specifically shellfish, like lobsters and so forth, presumably. And if we go from religion to ethics, then if shellfish is, say, sinful or unclean, I'm laying aside a lot of the complexities of the issue here, but let's just assume, being unclean is a sin, so it's against the religion to eat it. Therefore, going from religion to ethics, it would be immoral. So eating lobster would be, a path to hell. And the obvious thing is that, of course, cooked lobsters are red, the devil is red, so, obviously it's a path to hell. Now, one way to counter this would be to argue about whether eating lobster is actually a sin. And in some, religious debates, there is the claim that those dietary restrictions were lifted in the New Testament. I'm not a religious scholar, but people I've spoken to who are and who like eating lobster, that's their contention, that it is a sin, say in the Old Testament, the old restrictions in the diets, but now it's not considered, it's not considered unclean anymore in the New Testament. So the way to counter that mixing of norms would be to say, well, it is contended that eating lobster is a sin, but this is not true because, and then cite the appropriate biblical reference. And that would be a way to counter that. Now, the way to counter the counter is to, of course, try to argue that it does have the status. And there are those who do accept the New Testament, using the example of the lobster, but hold that those dietary restrictions were not actually lifted. And so kind of the fight there would be first trying to establish that it's a sin, then the counter argument would be that it's not a sin anymore, and then the counter would be establishing that it is in fact still a sin. The second way to attack this method is to try to break the link. Again, because the goal is to show that because something has a status in one area, say, good or bad, legal or illegal, that it therefore holds that it has that comparable status in another area. But if you can break the link, and this is kind of like, countering an analogy, then the argument fails, because the whole point is to link the two areas, and if you break the link, the argument does not succeed. So you'd want to try to show that the inference is not justified. Now, in some cases, there are already sort of pre-built ways to break the link. So, for example, a way to counter an argument for basing a law on religion in the United States would be to appeal to the separation of church and state. That would be one way to do it, at least here. Now, the link can also be attacked by arguing that the norms of one area do not apply to the other, or that one area actually overrides the other, thus preventing the inference. For example, this is kind of an unusual example, but a real one. I said, like in the case of aesthetics, generally aesthetics tends to be the loser in most disputes. But Oscar Wilde, who famous writer, and he wrote an essay called The New Aesthetics, and he argued that morality doesn't actually apply to art. And so Wilde's argument would be that people still want to impose morality on art, and his argument was that it does not. He gives reasons, for this, and that would be a way to break a link. So if someone says, well, this is wrong morally, so it applies to art, this is bad, and Wilde essentially has this argument to try to break that link. Another example, for many thinkers, they have arguments as to why morality should trump or override law. And, putting it super simply, one reason is that laws, for the most part, are just kind of like made up. And intuitively, to do an appeal to intuition, clearly there are many laws that are intuitively bad. That you can look at the laws, especially past laws, but even present ones, and see that they're like unfair, and even by the standards of law, they seem to be, bad laws. And so if you make a case that morality trumps law, then making inferences from law to morality wouldn't be justified, because if that were true, law does not, rule over morality. The opposite is true. So that's a bit on how to mix norms. Again, it's a method that can be quite effective, and if done right, can make an effective argument as to why something, say, that is a sin should be illegal, or something that is a sin should be immoral, or something that is immoral should be illegal. But from the standpoint of philosophy, as opposed to say politics, it has to be argued for. The transition must be made and cannot simply be assumed. But of course, in the world of politics, people just say stuff and don't really support that transition, which is unfortunate. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.